Welcome, everyone. I'm here today with Allan Leibowitz, the founder and editor of Digital Drummer Magazine. Welcome to Kick Snare.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me. And I'm really looking forward to sharing a couple of thoughts about the fastest growing segment of the drum markets and to hear what kind of things are of interest to you and your audience. So, yeah.
Terrific. Well, thank you for being here. It's a topic that's personally of interest to me because as a drummer who has lived in an apartment for the last, I don't know, 30-ish years or longer,
Yeah.
I haven't always had access to a place to play live. And I think the first digital drum I ever owned was a Roland Octopad, the first generation, and I managed to get a trigger pedal hooked up to it, and I thought I was pretty ahead of the curve. But
Yeah.
now you may not see it in its entirety in the background, but I have a Roland E-kit here, which is cobbled together from a few different generations, but with a TD 50 driving it, and it's what
Nice.
allows me
Yeah.
to practice, and I can
Yeah.
record here with it when I need to do something quickly, and
Yep.
it was a life changer for me and also for my son, who's now 21. He grew up playing on this kit
Right.
initially.
Okay.
So
Yeah. I think we will see a generation now of people for whom it is familiar, but you and I, it was something of a novelty when we started off, and
indeed,
that's probably part of the reason why I founded Digital Drummer Magazine back in 2010. So, like many middle-age crises, when when I picked up drumsticks again after not playing since school days, uh, I was like you in suburbia, and it was impossible to set up an acoustic kit, not only for the sake of my neighbors, but also for the sanity of my family.
sure,
So I started exploring electronic drums, and at that time, there certainly weren't a lot of choices, but even worse than that, there was not a lot of information. And I hit kind of all the mainstream music magazines, drumming magazines, and was really struck by how little was known. I'm a journalist. I started off in radio, and I've spent most of my life in kind of business journalism. I've done a lot of technology journalism and a lot of reviewing and technology stuff. And so the journalist in me said, before you make a purchase decision, you really need to understand what's out there. And I went around the drum stores and played with things and tried to research online. And as I say, there was nothing in the media. And so I thought I'd address that. And I actually started writing reviews, which were initially published in general music magazines in Australia. And I sort of became better and better known, and ended up writing for some of the biggest magazines in the world. But that was a very frustrating process because I don't know how much people know about the music publishing industry, but it's really quite a difficult industry, and the influence and impact of advertisers is enormous. So it's very hard to be critical of a regular advertiser on a magazine.
sure,
And
sure.
so there were a whole lot of issues which prompted me to decide that the only way to get decent information was to do it myself. And so in 2010, I put together the first edition of Digital Drummer, which it would plan to be a quarterly magazine, so one every 3 months. And we ran like that for a couple of years to very good audience response, not so much good industry response because we weren't kind of in the mold that they were used to dealing with. And also, we were a global publication, and global publications just didn't kind of fit into their wheelhouse at all because all of their marketing was national. So, there would be an account manager for the United States, there'd be one for England, there'd be one for
Sure.
Europe, there'd be one for Asia. And suddenly they get an email from this little guy in Brisbane, Australia saying, I've got a global audience. Can you please advertise in my magazine? So, I mean, that is still an issue now. We're 16 years later. It is still an issue that the structure of the organizations is such that they can't actually conceptualize producing a message for a global audience because
Sure.
their sales structures are all fragmented and geographic.
Yeah. Yeah.
But besides that, luckily I had a day job to keep me going, and this is really a passion project and one inspired by my own kind of thirst for knowledge and the
Understand.
enthusiasm of an audience that has followed me, pretty dedicatedly since I started. And in fact, their desire for information led to the launch of newsletters in the months between the magazines, because they all said 2 months, 3 months is too long to wait. So, we'd just about to release the February magazine, and then there'll be a March newsletter, an April newsletter, and then another magazine in May. So that's kind of how it's progressed since
Got
then.
it.
Yeah,
That's very interesting. I hadn't assumed that we would talk about this, but I'm fascinated by what you had to say about. I understand the issues in terms of go-to-market sales structure, different distributors in different countries. It's
yeah,
marketing budgets because as a lifelong marketer, I've spent some time wrestling with some of those issues,
yeah,
and I've also, how do I put it? Spent time dealing with journalists because I've managed PR teams and things like
yeah,
that, and have also been approached by media salespeople, sometimes from the same organization,
yeah,
sometimes within a week of those two things happening,
yeah,
or closer. And so there's always this idea that there would be a strict wall between editorial and commercial interests at any kind of publication, really,
yeah.
any sort of advertising supported media. And I've wondered myself in the category of music and otherwise, I don't think I've ever seen a particularly negative review in any of the music magazines of any gear, come to think of it. And I
Right.
guess I don't wanna sound completely naive, but, it seems like that really does a disservice to the consumer ultimately, and I appreciate the challenge
Absolutely.
that those magazines must
Yeah,
be under,
yeah.
but,
And in fact, to take it
painful.
a step further, I would say the situation is actually deteriorating now because the media are shrinking. The music media, the dedicated music media
Yes.
are shrinking, almost disappearing.
Mm,
And so the information task has been handed over to retailers. So you have people like Sweetwater
sure.
produce amazing material. I mean, I
Indeed.
don't for a second, have any quibble with the quality of what they're doing, but their priority is to sell gear. So I don't think we're going to see a Sweetwater review of a Roland product saying this is wrong with it. It's not going to work for you here. This is not going to work. And their intentions are obviously honorable, but they're a business
Sure, sure.
and they need to get clicks and they need to get sales. So
Yeah.
that's one of the main drivers of information now. And the other one is influencers. And this is a particularly annoying phenomenon for me because
Mhm.
increasingly I'm seeing people posting videos with reviews. These are people who've never done anything technological before,
Right.
and they'll get onto YouTube and they'll say this electronic kit that costs $399 is the best electronic kit ever built. Well, it may be the best electronic drum kit they've ever experienced, but
Sure.
do they understand, triggering dynamics? Do they understand triggering parameters? Do they understand latency? All of these kind of things that are important to people who are serious about the instruments, way over their
Yeah,
heads. But they
understood.
got a free kit from XY manufacturer and they're gonna, promote the hell out of it so that they get the next one when it comes out. So this is,
Yeah.
I think, the scourge of the music industry today. There are some influencers who are very good and understand their stuff. But unfortunately, when you just click on a link on YouTube, you don't know anything about their credibility, anything about the commercial aspects. I mean, there are these things, these affiliate programs. So every time you buy something based on an original video that you'd seen on YouTube, they get $15 or $20 or whatever. And I have those kind of approaches now on a constant basis, like people saying, we're not going to take advertising, but we'd like to sign you up as an affiliate. So, in other words, they're incentivizing me to say their kit is great so that they get the click throughs and they get the sales. And, the audience kind of becomes a commodity in the middle of that. The audience becomes a route to sales for the manufacturer or the distributor. And that's not a game I'm prepared to play. And, there are lots of people who you will probably never see an ad for in digital drama. And, that's one of the reasons. So, on the one
Understood.
hand, there's this complex sales structure that you touched on there. And the other side is that the newfound competition from influencers is obviously shaking up the market.
Sure. So you mentioned, triggers, and that's a good sort of place for us to segue into our first sort of topic on digital drums. And I let's assume for this conversation that our audience is largely I guess we'll start with drummers and possibly those who are interested or using digital kits. I can't imagine that the average layperson is going to want to tune in and hear about this in detail.
No.
So, but they also are likely to be a non-technical audience,
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
imagine. So,
Yeah.
I'd love for you to characterize trigger technology in general. Talk about what's out there now, what's working, what's not working,
Okay.
room for
Yeah.
improvement, that kind of thing.
Sure. Sure. So I guess basic trigger technology has not moved at all in the last 40 years. And that consists of a piezo, an electric sensor, and when it gets struck, it generates a current. And that little, $1 component is now at the heart of pretty much every single electronic drum kit you see out there, whether it be a $10,000 kit or a $299 kit. So that basic technology is pretty much a constant, and it has not changed. There are some new trigger technologies that have been developed since the early days, things like FSR, which is again a kind of membrane that generates current when it's struck. But the basic kind of physics and chemistry have not changed. What has changed is how it's dealt with. So you've got this electric current, and it's either you know an on or an off. That's basically what it is. The next kind of big step has been the likes of Roland and their digital triggers. So what they've done is, instead of just sending an on or off signal from the drum pad to the module, they've actually put a bit of a controller inside, a mini computer, as it were, and it does a lot of the thinking inside the drum before the signal comes out, and then the signal goes kind of as a MIDI signal via USB to the drum module. And that's kind of where the biggest development has been. So all of the excitement, all of the whiz bang bells and whistles, those are all really in the module, and that's where we're seeing the big development. So from the early days of an analog Simmons module, where it was basically just taking an on-off signal and using analog wizardry to make sounds out of it. Now you have kind of MIDI coming out, and you have all of the permutations that derive from this very, very powerful programming musical language that assigns different numbers to different notes, and is able to tell how hard you're hitting and where about on the drum you're hitting. And like the new Roland technology actually is not just head and rim. So it's one sound when you bang the rim and one when you hit the head. But now it's kind of they developed something called positional sensing, which is, it works out the distance between the head and the rim and where you're hitting, and it kind of makes a different sound depending on where on the head you're hitting. And they've now divided it into kind of 8 quadrants, and it even knows, whether you're hitting northeast, southeast, and how far from the center. So if you have the appropriate number of samples, and
Mhm.
again, you record samples on an acoustic drum and you map them,
Sure.
you can actually have all those nuances that we've come to expect from acoustic drums on an electronic drum. And that, that's kind of where the real technology is now evolving and developing. But basically, we're still back to, you hit a drum, it creates energy, it, creates a little on-off kind of signal from an electronic piezo, and that's where it all starts.
Right. So my perception is that at one time, and maybe it's still the case, that there were lots of people independently making triggers of one kind or another, cymbal and drum
Mm.
triggers and things like that,
Yeah.
and that's probably still happening because so much of the uh, action is happening within the brain, if you will, or
Mhm. The modules, yeah.
the module. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, does that make it harder for independent and smaller companies to innovate?
Mm, okay. Well, there have been a lot of independent sort of trigger makers, and so that goes right back to individuals at home with a DIY. And as I said, you need a $2, a $1 piezo, you need a block of foam, and a a jack, and you basically got a drum trigger. So the barrier to entry is very low. But then there are people who've done it really well. Back in the 90s, there was Hart Dynamics, started by Peter Hart, who at the time, really all of the electronic drums out there consisted of these kind of rubber pads, these pancake kind of tiny little triggers. And what Peter did was he started building real shells and putting triggers into them. And Peter really shook up the market quite significantly. Sadly, that was a disaster story because he was the victim of an internal fraud where one of his key managers actually defrauded his company of over $1 million, and none of his suppliers were paid. And eventually, Peter went broke, and unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. But he did
Horrible.
start a trend, and there have been a few people who've gone along that route, and the story is kind of mirrored in Europe by the likes of Drum Tech, which was initially a Hearts importer. So they did kind of take the triggering technology and wrap it into a form factor that was kind of more comfortable for traditional drummers. And then there've also been a number of other kind of developments, including uh, portable internal and external triggers. So, Roland obviously has the external, and D-Drum has the external triggers that we're all familiar with. You stick on the outside. Well, a couple
Sure.
of people started developing internal versions of that. So they're very small devices that you just take the head off, attach them to a lug screw, and basically you've got an electronic drum. So there's been a lot of technology, but as you say, um, the real development has been on the module side. And of course, there are companies like Roland who build triggers for their modules and, in a sense, build modules for their triggers. In fact, Yamaha was a case in point where, until recently, it was very difficult to get compatibility for a third-party trigger on a Yamaha module because they just did things differently.
Uh-huh.
And so you could have all of these wonderful, Heart Dynamic or whatever pads, but they just didn't play right on a Yamaha module. Now, I think the manufacturers are realizing that we're growing the industry. We've got to grow it as a whole. And so even the cheapest, most basic modules have parameters that allow you on the module to dial in triggers from other manufacturers. And so that has opened the market, and it has meant that, as you mentioned, you've got a Roland kit with various generations of pads attached to it.
Yeah. Also
You
also
really can't.
a couple of
Of
non-Roland,
Absolutely, yeah.
devices as well, sure.
And, just as you would expect to be able to download apps from non-Apple people on your iPhone, to ensure the usability of your product in the end, it is in everybody's interest to kind of create some kind of
Right.
platform where we can all use each other's equipment to some
Yeah.
extent. And,
That makes sense.
you get to a point where you want to grow your kit, you're not gonna throw it out and buy a new one. And if you just need another couple of pads and you don't really need to spend $800 on a name brand pad, you can achieve pretty much the same using some cheap alternative or something you built yourself.
Right. You mentioned, the recognition that we're trying to grow the industry. It reminds me of, when the MIDI standard first got adopted, it was a
Yeah,
huge boon to the industry. Suddenly,
yeah,
there was interoperability where it didn't exist before, and
yeah,
it really changed things dramatically. And
yeah,
so I have to imagine that, of course, MIDI plays a role in some of these platforms, but,
yeah,
had the general idea of interoperability is powerful
yeah,
for the
yeah,
industry.
yeah. Interestingly, at NAM a few years ago, a colleague and I tried to put together an industry group for electronic drums. It was called EPIC, the Electronic Percussion Industry Council. And we invited all the big players, and we had a meeting at NAM, and maybe half of them turned up. But there's enormous competition and enormous suspicion.
Sure.
And it is quite an incestuous industry. So you do find people, moving from one manufacturer to another. So there's a lot of suspicion. And unfortunately, they still perceive their rivals as the competition. And the competition, we believe, is not the competition, is not their rivals, but acoustic drums. That's the competition. And if there is a task, it's kind of overcoming the negativity, the suspicion, um, and some of the kind of darker overtones of the electronic drumming industry for mainstream acoustic drummers. And, any of your audience who've been in a band and arrived one day and said, "Okay, guys, I'm ditching the acoustics. We're moving to electronics." There are real looks of horror and suspicion from
I'm afraid
what are
so.
we triggering and playing loops and what's going on now. And so there is quite a lot of there is quite a lot of negativity to overcome before electronic percussion does become mainstream, even
Right.
though it is by far the fastest growing segment of the market. And you go into any drum store now, and more than half of the real estate on the floor will be electronic because that's
Right.
the way the market is going out of necessity.
I wanted to talk more, and this might be a good place to do it, to understand the role of electronic drums in a live performance situation. I've seen them in certain cases, but still it's rare. You may see a Roland pad, SBX Pro, SBDX Pro. I forget. I have them
SPD,
behind me. I can.
SBDS,
Yeah.
SX, yeah,
Yes. Exactly. Thank you. And you'll see them used for triggering loops and other things. And I'm sure as playback and as playback has become a huge thing in
yeah,
live touring. So certainly there's some of that going on, but you still, even when you see electronic kits, generally they look like acoustic kits in most
yeah,
big tours from what I've seen.
yeah,
What are the advantages, disadvantages of using electronic kits in a live situation from your
right.
perspective?
Well, firstly, I think there's a misperception that electronic drums are somehow strange and new. Besides the SPDSXs, which are visible, for decades now, big global touring shows have been powered by electronic drums. They've mostly been hidden. So
Right. Using triggers on
you've
acoustic
had
kits or whatever. Yeah.
acoustic looking kits, and,
Hmm.
and they're on stage because of endorsements and marketing and all of the other stuff.
Sure.
But behind that Ludwig kit is actually, a Roland TD-30. Um, and I'll give you an example. If you've ever seen Fleetwood Mac live, you'll
Hmm.
see uh, Mick Fleetwood hitting something, and suddenly there's this bell chime. And if you know the Roland bell chime,
Mm.
that's what he's triggering, even though he has this beautiful acoustic bell chime
Sure.
on stage. But to get the sound of the bell chime to all of the sonic clutter on stage, you're just not going to hack it with a microphone. So what have they done? They're using samples. Um, Elton John's percussionist, John Mahon, his kit is he's got all of the classic percussion pieces, but 70-80% of what he's doing is on a Yamaha module.
I
He's
see.
triggering. So yes, electronic percussion has been on stages at the Super Bowl, at every big show you've ever seen for as long as we've known. But finally, because some of these companies are now big enough to do their own marketing, we're actually seeing it come forward. So, what are the advantages? I mentioned Mick Fleetwood's bell chime. You know, when there are sounds that are very delicate and you can't capture them on a noisy stage, samples. You just have to use samples. Um, but bringing it right back to your average, weekend warrior band, we're playing venues now where there are sound restrictions, 100
Mm.
decibels or whatever. You try and do that with an acoustic kit. So increasingly, a lot of venues are actually demanding electronic drums because of the noise
Interesting.
control. And what happens? So you've got an acoustic kit playing at 90 decibels, then the lead guitarist can't hear himself, so he turns it up. Then the vocalist can't hear, so he turns that up. And eventually you've got 200 decibels coming up.
Right.
And everybody's just doing their thing and playing what they believe to be moderately quietly.
Mm.
With an electronic drum kit, you set the level, that's it. It doesn't matter how much you thrash your drums, that's the level you get in. And similarly, it doesn't matter how hard you hit, you can still get very delicate sounds, which you couldn't do with an acoustic kit. You can do brushes, but then there's a whole different timbre and tone and feel. You can use rods, but how do you get it really down and maintain your energy and the feel of the song? You just can't do it with an acoustic kit under low volume conditions. So volume control, sound control, replicability. how much time does a band have to spend tuning the kit before each gig? You switch on an electronic drum kit, it sounds exactly the same as it did yesterday and the same as it'll sound tomorrow. As long as, you've maintained it, as long as, the head tension is right, as long as the internal components aren't degrading, as long as somebody has messed with the trigger settings or whatever, it's the same sound every time you hit it. So I think the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages, but there are obviously disadvantages. You have a power surge, you have somebody hitting the wrong thing. There are a whole
Right.
bunch of things that can go wrong, as with
Sure.
any electronic instrument. But, bands are playing with synthesizers, bands are playing with electronic guitars. So this whole electrification of music is not something new. Um, Obviously, the big negative, I suppose, has been the visual. Um, sure, Simmons made the visual their signature. You saw a Simmons kit, you knew what to expect. They knew that they couldn't do what they did on an acoustic kit. So, yeah, this is, look at me, I'm different.
Right. They went with
Um,
it.
a-
Yeah.
and it was different in a pleasant way. Then you had these kind of thin, wispy looking trigger pads and, clunky rubber signals, rubber cymbals, and they didn't look very good. But now you have acoustic style kits right across the board from, almost the cheapest kit on the block to the flagship Roland, Zildjian, Alesis, Yamaha kits. They all
Mm.
look acoustic. And you'd have to look pretty closely to realize that they were an electronic drum kit. So, yes, I'm a bit biased, but
That's
I
okay.
think I'm also realistic. And, this kind of dirty secret of electronics in live performance is now out there, and no one's
Indeed.
embarrassed about it anymore. But the biggest problem I think that drummers will have is the kind of perception that there's something wrong with playing electronic drums, that you're cheating, that you're using loops, that you're not, you're quantizing your playing. Well, you can't really do that in real time. So
No, no.
what they're hearing is what you're playing. That's it.
Right. Especially considering, as I mentioned earlier, how many people are now playing to tracks or,
Yeah,
to
yeah,
playback of some kind or playing to a click anyway. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
hopefully there'll be less
yeah,
stigma around that kind of thing.
yeah. But and that is
It reminds me of I'm reminded of Bob Dylan going electric. It was
yeah,
scandalous
yeah,
at the time.
yeah,
So
yeah.
maybe this will
Heresy.
yeah, over time, maybe things will
Yeah.
change.
But interestingly, I review an artist for the cover of every edition, and almost to a person, they've all said that if you don't have some electronic drum exposure, experience, understanding, you're just not going to get a gig today. So, mastery of the SPD, SPDSX, whatever, it is an absolute must because everybody has loops, everybody has, bits of their album that they want to recreate live, which
Hmm.
you're not going to be able to play on the spot. And more, the drummer is actually becoming the music director because they're triggering these things. They're holding it all together. They're, using Ableton or whatever to keep
Right.
the performance synced. And, personally, I find it hard enough just kind of remembering what song is next and what the tempo is.
I'm with you.
And and to have to, manage the whole band sound via a laptop while you're still keeping the beat. I have a lot of respect for some of the drummers that we're
Yeah.
seeing out there now.
I like the idea of having a music director in my ear. There's a drummer, I think his name is Chris Garcia, who posts a lot of stuff on social media, and he shares his in-ear feed.
Yeah,
And he's a worship drummer, and so he's
right.
playing in a big church setting with a big band, and
Yeah.
there's a music director who's calling out cues. Okay, get
Yep.
ready for the build here
Yeah. Yeah.
and chorus.
Yep.
And that actually would be kind of nice to have somebody in my ear telling, reminding me of the form of the song because
Yeah. Yep.
as I get
Yeah.
older, that's the harder part.
Yeah.
And
Somebody who
I also sing and play, so I
yeah,
got to
well,
remember lyrics, tempo, everything.
yeah. It can be a bit distracting, but, I've heard some fantastic examples. Cirque du Soleil, often their drummer is their music director, and he would or she would, sit down before the performance and actually mark everything out, and it would all be audio cues, and I've heard some of those. It's just astounding, and coming up in 3, 2, 1, and then the
Yeah.
change of tempo and whatever, and it's
Yeah,
all
and they put
just
them in
like
Ableton
in your
and
head. Yeah,
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 it's amazing how
yeah,
things have evolved in that way. So hopefully some of the stigma will, abate over time. I
yeah,
also I've always been interested personally just in the sounds that come out of, electronic drums. So I have a chord wave drum, for example. I've
yep,
never used it on a gig, but I've played around with it in the studio and I've made some really interesting things. It's
yep,
inspired some really cool ideas, and
yep,
there are things that electronic drums are really well suited
yeah,
for.
yep,
It sort of sit outside of perhaps my day-to-day, uh, work playing with a rock band.
yep,
I don't have a lot of time for changeovers in clubs in New York, so I'm generally playing a house kit, and I'm just bringing a snare and
yep,
cymbals and a hi-hat clutch and
yeah,
maybe a pedal.
yep,
Um, but the if I had more time,
yep,
I would certainly be integrating more electronics into my setup and taking
yep,
advantage of it for
yeah.
one reason or another.
Yeah. Well, if you're in a covers band and you're switching from a Led Zeppelin song to, something on brushes, it's just it's just a click and you're on a different drum kit and a whole different sound, whole different feel. Um, and you don't have to stuff around and look for a new pair of sticks and get towels to put on the toms,
Right,
and
right.
the sonic possibilities for live performance are enormous. And yes, most of the manufacturers really boast about the number of kits that they have, and they have 200 kits or 600 kits or whatever. The reality is, you can probably get by with two or three, like three or four, depending on how diverse your set list is,
Sure.
and that's it. That's all you would need, and the audience wouldn't necessarily understand the nuance, but the musicians in the room will certainly get it, and the drummers in the room will go, "Hang on, what's going on here?" How's he gone from a 67 Ludwig kit to a DW
Right. How do you go from
exotic?
mahogany to maple and
Yeah,
back again? Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
it's interesting.
yeah,
So let's focus on studios. I have some personal experience using a Roland kit to drive one software package or another. I won't
yep,
bother mentioning them here in my home studio because it's the only way I can record drums
yep,
at home.
yep,
Um, when I've recorded otherwise, I've recorded acoustic drums and, of course, spent a day getting sounds and miking up the kit and all that.
yep,
Um, Often, as I understand it, producers are replacing the acoustic sounds in the studio anyway. So
yep,
there's a certain amount of irony in terms of how much time is spent finding the perfect microphone and the perfect vintage
yep,
kit, et cetera, just to find things swapped out in a mix later or whatever.
yep,
So I'm curious as to your thoughts about that and whether or not people should just start using electronic kits in the studio.
yeah. Well, I think COVID was something of a benchmark there, or something of a watershed. Um, you know, I think COVID stopped people getting together to produce music, and music didn't suffer. Yes, at some kind of emotional level, we missed out on being with our buddies and the immediate interaction, but music continued. And I think the economics have changed as well. Producers just don't have the resources to pay for a drummer to sit in a studio for 4 days to get the perfect sound.
Mm.
Um, and the reality is that people can sit at home on an electronic drum kit, produce the performance captured in MIDI, and then apply samples. And the samples that we have access to today are just unbelievable at any price point. I know of a lot of top 10 hits that have been produced using addictive drums, which is a $200 package. And very easy to use and very easy to follow and huge sonic variation. And not only, the pre-mixed kits, but then you can get in there and if you're if you're that way inclined, you could start editing the attack and the decay and the envelope and, all kinds of effects that you couldn't even achieve in a studio, really. So I think one, the economics have changed. The mindset has changed. The realization that we can just sit in a tiny little room in the back of our house and produce a world-class performance that can make it onto an album with absolutely no intervention. It's
Yeah,
just mind-boggling. I mean,
it
you
is.
couldn't do that with an acoustic kit. You just couldn't.
No, and even with an unlimited budget, you wouldn't
Yeah.
switch from a acoustic reggae tuned kit to a John Bonham sounding kit in the
Yep.
same day even.
No.
And so being able to dial up, a different kit change the sounds, add delays, do all sorts of things like
Yep.
on the way,
Yep.
just on the fly, drives the creative process differently. At least it has
Yep.
for me as a, home composer,
Yep.
producer. I'll put small p. No one's paying me to do it, that's for sure. But I do it for myself, and having access to different sounds drives the creative process in different directions.
Yeah. Yep.
I can imagine if I owned 20 different guitars and they all were tuned different, not tuned differently, but different types of guitars with through different amps with different
Yep.
effects. Each time I pick one up, it might inspire me to go in a different direction, and I found
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
true
Yeah.
with e-drums. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
oh, we'll see.
But
See,
it's not just the sound; it's also the perfection of the performance. So there's a wrong note there, or the bass was not, the kick drum was out of
Mhm.
time on one piece. Just get into MIDI if you're that way inclined. Drag it. You don't have to do the whole performance again. This bit that's really
Right.
good, copy it, paste it somewhere else in the
Allan,
timeline,
I
and
have
and there you
never
go.
done such a thing. I've
I'm
never
sure
done such a
nobody's ever
thing.
done that, but the possibility exists for those who might, in a rare circumstance, make an error.
Hypothetically, one
Yes,
could
it is
shift the
possible.
timing on something if they really found an egregious mistake.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Everything is just done on the fly.
yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
No, it's very cool stuff. I mean, being able to go in and
Mm-mm.
fix that one thing that's not right, or change the feel slightly by moving the timing on something. I mean, I don't typically quantize an entire song or anything like that, but I certainly have thought, "Damn, that snare drum feels late." I want to
Yeah,
just move it a tiny
yeah,
bit,
yeah.
and
Or even the
I don't
ability
feel
to
too
see
guilty.
if it is late. I mean, it might sound
That's a
late,
good
and
point.
and then you look at the MIDI and you realize, no, it's just the way it fell, and
It's the
and it
rest of
works
the
fine.
band. It's the rest of the band that's off, not me.
Absolutely, yeah. But no, I think it does open possibilities, and again, it's all about efficiency and
Mm,
and productivity, and the ability to work in a space that you're comfortable with. There's no travel costs, there's no hotel, there's no fighting New
true.
York traffic to get to the studio. You just have breakfast and walk to your e-kit and produce 5 top 10 hits for the day, and
There you
um,
go.
and then think about how you're gonna live on the proceeds.
There you go. That sounds like a good vision. So, before people get to that place where they're producing those, top 10 hits in the course of a day, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the use of, electronic kits within, music education in learning environments.
Yeah.
To me, that seems like a great opportunity that I haven't seen a ton of people take advantage of yet.
Yep, yep. Okay, well, I guess there are a couple of aspects to this. The first is the kits themselves, and even the most modest beginner kit today has built-in tools. So they have practice tools where you can play along either to a song or to a beat or a rhythm, and it
Mhm.
actually measures you in real time. So
Oh, right.
you're 5% late, you're 10% early, and you watch this, and it's a great learning tool because yes, intuitively, we might think that we're on the beat or we're not on the beat. But to actually see it and to see, you know, I, I hate using these things personally. When I get a review kit, I hate doing them because they just show up my fallibility. And, to get a score of 70, 80% is, wow, I've achieved something. Whereas, when I'm playing semi-professionally, I need to be 100%. But the
Sure.
reality is you can see it, and certainly for the next generation who come up learning drums this way, I think it is gonna shape their technical skills and help them develop, very real senses of what they're doing. Maybe not. I mean, maybe, they'll lose that innate sense and they'll rely on seeing the score on the screen. But the beauty is that the tools are there, and the ability to take a song, um click a loop that you want to learn, so beginning and end, and just keep playing it over and over again until you got it nailed, and then you pick the next loop and you do it over and over again until you get. How difficult is that to do? Without the tools, you have to record it, you have to somehow create the loop, and you want to speed it down, speed it up, slow it down. You could do all of these things on the module. So the tools are there, and the tools generally are pretty good. From the most basic kit to the most advanced, I think the tools are pretty good, and everybody would benefit from spending some time using them. And the
Right.
other thing, of course, is what did we do when we learned? We put on an album or a cassette and we played and, played the song again.
Over and over.
Here you have access to pretty much everything on your iPhone. There's a song you want to play, you just dial it up, patch it through by Bluetooth, and you're playing along with it. Of course, I think we'll get into the ability of removing drum tracks from pre-mixed music, but that's another story in itself. So I think the experience is so much more gratifying now because you're playing to real stuff that you like at a time when you want, and it's instant. So one, you can do the patterns. Two, you can do the songs you like. Now, thirdly, I have seen a couple of universities institute electronic drum labs where they will have all of the students using electronic kits. They'll all feed through to a mixer where the lecturer, instructor can, you know, in, can open the pot and hear what one student is doing and switch to another student. They can all hear him simultaneously or her. So there's this real two-way interaction. Preferably they can't hear each other because that would be immense. But
Sure.
the ability to play your kit, play along with somebody who is listening to you, monitoring you, giving you feedback, all in a quiet environment. I mean, can you imagine, 30 drum kits in a room,
Right.
acoustic kits, and an instructor trying to make head or tail of that? In the old days, we would have you play that, not you play that. You Well, now they all play it simultaneously, and he
That's
just
interesting.
switches between them. So there are a lot of institutions already using them. But there is a lot more work to be done to kind of commercialize that and make it easily transportable from one environment to another.
Right.
And I think the the industry as a whole is kind of so focused on the consumer market and to some extent on the bottom end of the consumer market,
Mm.
where there's a lot of money to be spent and a lot of churn. That academic kind of applications are not really top of mind, but I suspect at some stage there will be, because the institutions will drive it. They just can't afford to have rooms full of acoustic kits, and
Yeah.
try and do mass education at the same time. Acoustics is
Yeah.
fine one on one, but for a big audience, I think you just need to go electronic. So I
Right.
think there are opportunities there. I think the technology is there. It's just a matter of melding them together and optimizing.
Right. They used an electronic kit at the high school that my son went to, and he played drums there. They didn't use it so much for he didn't, let me rephrase. He didn't take drum lessons at school, so it wasn't
Really?
used in that sense, but they used it at their performances that they did in the auditorium because
Yeah.
they had a volume issue,
Yeah.
they
Exactly.
couldn't
Yeah.
play too loud,
Yeah.
and, so the guitar amps were small, the bass amp was small, and the
Yeah.
electronic drum kit, was going through a PA.
Yeah.
To me, it was a little frustrating to hear the pads, but, hey, that's
So
okay,
you could hear the
hear the
pad
pads out
noise.
in the room.
You could
Yeah, a
hear the
little bit.
pad noise above. Right. Okay.
Well, of course, I was the father with the camera right
Yeah.
up front, making sure
Right.
that I could
Okay. Yeah.
capture
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that anybody else would have noticed,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I
That
think
is
it was
actually
good that they had it.
that is actually one thing that people overlook quite commonly with electronic drum is amplification. Because 90% of the time we're actually playing at home by ourselves with headphones or whatever. And
Indeed.
again, it's important to have good quality headphones. But amplification is an issue, and often, if you're playing a club or whatever, and they're just putting you through the PA and there isn't a decent sub, then yes, the sound
It's
will be
gonna suffer,
suboptimal.
yeah,
So there is
yeah.
a requirement for some decent amplification and for some decent kind of dialing in of the sounds.
Right.
And, most of the modules have built-in EQ, so you can adjust them to the room, but it is often overlooked. And, I have readers all the time saying, "Can I just plug into a guitar amp?" Well, no, you can't.
Mm,
Or, "Can
no.
I plug into the home stereo?" Yes, if you want to blow your speakers first time you use it.
Yeah.
But it is important. It is a musical instrument, and you need to listen to it musically, and you do need a dedicated amp, which again doesn't have to cost the earth. Just like everything else in the industry, we have products starting from a couple of $100 going to a couple of $1,000, and
Right.
depending on where you sit in the continuum, you can definitely find something that meets your needs at a decent price and that turns it into something of a joy rather than a tedium.
Right. I think the guitarists are evolving quite a bit in this regard already. The guitarist in my band uses, a modeling stomp box of some kind, I
Yep,
forget which one of the fancy ones,
yep,
and he plugs straight into the PA now when we go to a club.
yeah, yep,
So the requirement for a more powerful, more capable PA probably exists not
yeah,
just for the sake of, electronic drummers, but also
yep,
for guitarists.
yep,
It's hard for me to imagine bass players doing it, but,
yep,
eventually, if the PAs are good enough, maybe that
yeah,
would make sense, and we might have a little bit, lower volume on stage even.
yeah, yeah. Well, that can be our next campaign. Once we've converted the world to electronic drums, we can start looking
Yeah.
at bass
Well,
guitars.
it's interesting to me because guitarists for so long have fetishized their cabinets and the speakers in the
Yeah,
cabinets, and, I don't wanna poke fun at them too much, but there's so much, uh invested in that piece of
yeah,
it,
yeah,
and of course, all the electronics before the amp, and now they're streamlining, and they're realizing they have many points of failure within their setups if they have
yeah,
tons of
yeah,
stomp boxes and lots of
yeah,
little cables in
yeah,
between them, and then an amp that can blow a fuse or
yeah,
that can have a fuse die,
yeah,
I should say, and there's, I think good reasons for them to go through the PA as long
yeah.
as they fold back nicely for the drummer so I can hear the guitarist still. Then
In
then
years.
then it's all good. It's all good. It's getting
Yeah,
better,
yeah,
little at a time. So, you mentioned, drum parts and taking drum parts out. I worked, for a while with a company called Moises, which has a
yeah,
fantastic, stem separation. It's generically what we call that. Um, it's a fantastic platform, and it's now available across devices, and it's,
mm,
portable, and your music is in the cloud, and I use it all the time.
yeah,
And 2 interesting innovations recently. They came out with a stem separation model that actually separates most of the instruments on a drum kit. So hi-hat, kick, snare, cymbals, all separately. And I have found that interesting to use when I really wanna dissect a part. Sometimes
yeah,
I can't hear exactly what's happening,
yeah,
and it can be very helpful. And of course, being able to drop the drums out and play along,
yep,
drummer, or to, isolate your own drumming. I record our rehearsals in Voices, and then I bring it home and I can, separate it and, take the drums out once I've when I wanna practice to something
yeah,
new that we've written in the studio.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so it's been a real great boon for me in that way.
yep,
The second, I think, and maybe perhaps even more game-changing development for them is they're now doing it on hardware, so it doesn't need to go out to the cloud to their servers
mhm,
anymore. And so the idea that you can do it through hardware, through a speaker, enables a few things. For one thing, if it can do it on the fly, it changes the relationship between the music and the end user in a way.
mm,
You can
mm,
take your phone or whatever your audio source is, run it through your drum module. If your drum module incorporates this kind of technology,
mm,
you can very simply dial the drums in or out if you
yeah,
want on
yeah,
the far end. And I think that could be a nice game changer
yeah,
if companies start to put it into the modules.
yeah. Yeah, it is, it's something that have been of huge interest to our readership because the pursuit of drumless tracks is a big thing for electronic drummers, certainly in terms of practice. And
It kinda
we've
lives in the
been,
gray area, at this
mhm,
point, yeah.
yeah, and we've been tracking this for some time, and I've pretty much reviewed all of the offerings.
Mhm.
And increasingly, we're now seeing it built into doors, which is quite something. So, and even down to Apple's Logic has a stem separator. So
Indeed.
you just take a WAV file or an MP3, load it into your door, and bang, you get four discrete stems. There are obviously some issues around this. There's an expectation that you're going to get pristine instruments
Mm.
in the four separate stems, and people kind of tend to overlook. You can't unscramble an egg effectively,
Right. Right.
and so depending on how tightly mixed the sounds are originally, you can sometimes get excellent results, and
Mm.
sometimes you get very poor results. And you know, I have a bunch of songs that I routinely use, some of which would have the snare and the rhythm guitar like so tightly synced that none of the stem separators can really pull them
Hmm.
apart. And those are the real tests. But there are a lot of, basic four on the floor songs that
Yeah, it
you
works
would
fine
get
for
very clean stems.
yeah.
Um, and certainly clean enough to just remove the drums and
Yeah, for
not
the sake of
lose too
practice.
much of the
Yeah.
of the other bits. But
Yeah.
I think expectations are very high for people who haven't tried it before. And the first lesson is, you're not going to get perfect drum removal. You'll get pretty close. There might be the odd, cowbell or something that's at a unique frequency that it doesn't recognize as a drum. Um, but the reality is that it's a huge resource and a huge boon to practice. And if you have to learn a song, uh, both to take the drums out so that you can just play along to the track, or to listen to the drums themselves
Sure.
and kind of emulate and learn the parts. So I think we're already going to get better and better at this. And as you say, increasingly we're seeing offerings that are now claiming to separate individual drum instruments. So cymbals, hi-hats, snare, and kick. And the better we get at that, you might be able to go in and just replace the kick. If you've done a recording and you don't like the kick and you haven't done it through a VST and you don't have it in MIDI, maybe you can just pull the kick out and
Yeah.
replace that.
Could be useful for that kind of thing for sure. I certainly producers are using it to reconstruct when they're doing remastering or they're doing spatial mixes now when they don't have the original multi tracks. There's a lot of application there, but I think even just in the context of practice, it's very powerful. And there, the uh, quality of the separation becomes less critical. It's good
Yeah,
enough to practice to if you
yeah,
can
yeah,
drop out
yeah,
the drums from your
yeah,
rehearsal the other night, for
yeah.
example.
Mm.
So one thing I've always been curious about is accessibility along two different lines. So on the one hand, electronic drums, because they can be played at a lower volume in smaller spaces, in homes, not necessarily in studios, those types of things, provides more opportunity for more people to play drums, I think.
Yeah,
That's my
yep,
theory.
yep,
At the same time, electronic drumming or electronic drums probably have an opportunity to benefit those who are differently abled. Do you have any thoughts on that or any experience with how people are using electronic drums in that context?
Well, I'll just say one name and it'll bring it all into perspective. Rick Allen. So there you go. Somebody who lost an
Indeed.
arm. And this was way back in the early days of electronics.
Yeah.
And he realized that he could replicate the parts he would have played with his missing arm using his kick pedal and triggers. So, yes, I think this is a great area where we can apply technology to people with different needs. And there are a number of innovations, not least the separation of the physical act from the sound. So, the beauty of electronic drums is you hit a pad and you can assign any sound you like to that pad. So as Rick Allen did, using his bass uh, pedal to trigger a snare sound. Um, if you only have, if you don't, regardless of which limb you're missing, you can move those notes, articulations, sounds onto another pad and fill in. There are a couple of instruments which most of the audience won't be familiar with, like the Zen drum, which is a handheld trigger
Oh,
device. I actually have
right.
one here, which I could show you. But so instead of playing your bass drum with your foot, you would use the palm of your hand. So you have
Right.
one trigger
I
here,
think
and
I
you
think I've seen those
okay.
things.
So you can
Yeah.
play a whole drum kit
Sort of you hold
effectively
it
with.
almost like a guitar, sort of.
Yep, yep. So you can
Yeah.
play a whole drum kit. Well, let me grab one just so if
Sure, why
purely
not?
academic.
Show us. Show
Um,
us.
but there you go. There she is.
Very
I'm
cool.
I'm not going to demonstrate it plain, but effectively, what I would do is I would have the drum pedal there, the bass pedal there, snare, hi-hat there, and snare there. So, I'd be doing that, and that would be a groove. So
That's
there
neat.
you go. For people who have one functioning limb, uh, you know, they would be able to very quickly master that and, produce beats without too much effort.
Well,
Um,
now you've just shown me another piece of gear that I think I now have to own, so
Yeah, well, we won't talk
damn
about the
it.
cost and we won't talk about the programming, but it's very cool.
Yeah.
When I was at NAM probably 6 or 7 years ago. I went to a demo by a semi-paraplegic drummer who didn't have any control of the lower half of his body, and he developed a voice MIDI to drum trigger device where he could play the bass by just going doo, 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 doo. The mic would pick that up, MIDI
Right,
notes,
right.
bass drum. So there are a lot of people doing a lot of things.
Yeah, voice to MIDI is a big
Some
thing now, yeah.
some specifically for the utterly able,
Mhm.
and some just reapplying what we take as mainstream, for people who have different abilities. So
Got it.
I think electronic drums certainly allow people who wouldn't be able to physically play an acoustic kit to start playing. The other thing, of course, is finger drumming. And
Mhm.
our cover story in the next edition is a Dutch finger drumming educator. And this is an enormous market which has been totally overlooked by pretty much everyone except the millions of people who playing finger drums. So this is the, ACMI MPS or
The
whatever,
NPCs, yeah.
MPCs, yeah.
I
And
have one here on the floor.
there are a whole range of those, again, at every price point from,
Mm.
a couple of $100 to thousands. And some of them actually, now there's a new Yamaha range that incorporate sounds and effects on the unit itself. So you don't have to connect it to anything else except your amplifier or headphones. And this again, you've got a whole drum kit opened up using your fingers, and you could do it with one hand if you only had one hand. Um, but it is opening up drumming to a generation of people who, I mean, our interviewee himself can't play drums. You give him sticks and he'll, use them to eat his chop suey. Um, he just has no skills with drumsticks, but put this pad in front of him and he's producing professional albums using an array of 16 pads in his fingers and some software.
Huh.
And so I think again, there's another whole area of, what is this about? Is this about the gear or is this about the product, the output, the music? And if we think of the gear as just a means to an end rather than an end in itself, and you were talking before we went um, online about your review of a Ludwig snare. Uh, Fantastic piece of gear, beautiful, historic, whatever. But is it really about that piece of wood, or is it about the music it produces and how it can be used? And I think that's kind of one of the things I've tried to achieve with Digital Drummer is take electronic drumming out of the domain of the nerds and the tech geeks and put it into the domain of musicians and give them an insight into what can be achieved, how it can make your life easier, how it can make your performance uh, more accessible, how it can enrich the whole musicality of drumming. So, I think like any technology, it's a means to an end rather than an end in itself.
I think that's very well said. I think we can leave it there. I think that's a good place for us to finish. So,
Great.
thank
Thank
you
you,
very
Michael.
much. This was
Thank
great.
thank you for your interest, and thank you for helping spread the word. I'm not evangelical about this, but certainly electronics have allowed me to get back into drumming at a time when it would have been impossible to bring an acoustic kit into my life. It's obviously the whole Digital Drummer magazine experience has been incredibly enriching because it's exposed me to fantastic people around the world, and drummers really are. I know this might sound cliched, but drummers really are a very special breed of people. You look at lead guitarists who often turn their back to the audience in case another guitarist out there can see what they're doing. You know, they're you there are, I think we all have stereotypes of our, the different characters in our bands, the
Sure.
ego-driven singers, whatever. But I think drummers have just always been down to earth. I've spoken to some of the biggest drummers on the planet who've just been really nice guys and girls and really keen to share their story and help others along and, just revel in the joy of music and their role in it and try and bring everyone along for the ride. And I just this experience has been so enriching. I've met fabulous people. I've played, wonderful gear, and I get to do things like this and share my story. So thank you very much for helping
That's
spread the
terrific.
light.
Well, I'm glad to have you along and really appreciate the conversation. So
Great.
so thank you very much. And stay tuned. We'll perhaps talk again about some other topics related to drumming or music in general. So thanks for taking
Absolutely.
the time today.
I'd love it. Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael. You
Okay.
take care.